Hello, I'm Krista Dennett, pelvic floor exercise specialist. In this video, I'm going to elaborate on Kegels. Now, you may have been told that you should be doing these, especially postpartum. But one thing that I learned in the last 2 years working alongside pelvic floor physical therapists is there's more than just doing a simple contraction. Now, I know from my experience in pelvic floor health and exercise and movement that we need to learn how to coordinate our breath, pelvic floor contraction, and movement, and that's something that I've been teaching for over 7 years now. In the last 2 years, what I've learned is that there are different ways we should make sure we can engage our pelvic floor. So I created this video as a support video for my self-directed programs for pelvic floor exercise rehabilitation. But I feel that this information is so important for women because often we think we're doing our Kegels correctly and yet we're still having issues like leaking, the feeling of pressure from a prolapsed bladder or rectum. Or maybe we're feeling pain, back pain, hip pain, pelvic pain, and we're not sure why because we're doing our exercises we're told to do. So watch this video and learn the 4 key areas that a pelvic floor physical therapist will assess for function of your pelvic floor. Now, don't forget, for continued valuable information on pelvic floor health and exercise and movement, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And before we get started, watch my disclaimer.
Take a moment to read the disclaimer, as this video does not replace medical advice or treatment plan and is used for general education and demonstration purposes.
Let's talk about your pelvis and your pelvic floor. Let's just have a quick look at the pelvis. So the pelvis has 2 wing tips here, and they are connected by the pubic joint at the front and the SI joints connecting to the tailbone at the back. Now, a lot of times when people say they have SI joint pain, that's because chances are there's some pelvic dysfunction, instability in the muscles, causing these wingtips to kind of shift back and forth, putting strain on the SI joint. Sometimes people can indicate they have pubic pain through the front. Most likely this is because there's strain on the pubic joint here. This is very common in pregnancy as well, when we have inflammation of the pubic joint known as pubic symphysis dysfunction. So all of this is related to pelvic function. Alignment is key in order to allow for the flow of the pelvic floor. So for example, if you are standing in a bum tucked position, your spine would be going up more rounded this way. It would make it difficult for the diaphragm to press down, and it makes it difficult for these layers of pelvic floor muscles to contract. They're a bowl shape inside. This is the deep layer, and on the outside we have the superficial layer. We want to be able to engage through the superficial layer. In order to do so, it helps to have ideal alignment. Also, when we have ideal alignment, our pelvic organs, particularly our bladder, can rest on the pubic bone versus bum tucked, hips forward. There's an easy descent through the vagina. Okay, so we want to check in with our alignment as part of the function. So we'll get into that in posture. So let's talk about these muscles in particular, the superficial and the deep layer. Most often people are doing their Kegels, they think that they are contracting, but they're just engaging the superficial layer of muscle. And we want to lift into that deep layer of muscle. When you have a pelvic floor exam by a pelvic floor physical therapist, they will do an internal exam and they will be inserting a finger or two to test the function of those muscles. So when they're testing the function of the muscles and they ask you to do a contraction, they're going to see how deep they can feel those muscles getting strong or contracting around their fingers. So if it's a superficial, it may just be the lower part, and as they go into the deep layer, you can feel it up the fingers. So they measure pelvic strength out of it from a 0 to a 5. 0 can't do a pelvic floor contraction altogether. 5, you can get right into that deep layer of contraction. The other thing they're going to measure for is, are you able to hold that pelvic floor contraction no more than 10 seconds? And at what depth or strength can you hold it? So are you able to get halfway up the fingers, or 3 out of 5, and hold it for 8 to 10 seconds? Or can you not hold on to that contraction at all? Or maybe you can, but it's just the superficial layer. They're also going to look at agility, and that is the ability to turn the pelvic floor on and off very quickly. They want to make sure that you can get into that deep layer really quick, but also be able to release it. Usually what they're looking for is roughly 10 contractions, 10 quick contractions inside of about a 10 to 15 second period. More like 15 seconds, I should say, than 10. But that's what they're looking for agility. And then finally, the ability to lengthen and relax the pelvic floor. If that is a struggle to do, then we would have what's known as hypertonic pelvic floor. Where does this come into play with exercise and movement? Well, strength can play a factor in continence. So you may have a weak pelvic floor, and that's all you have, but it's giving you leaking. You could leak through what's called urge incontinence or stress urinary incontinence. Urge incontinence is when you have to go, you cannot hold it, you have to get to the bathroom right away. Stress urinary incontinence is when you might cough or sneeze or move really quickly or do a jump and you have incontinence. Weak pelvic floor alone can cause low back pain and hip pain, because if those muscles aren't functioning to maintain your stability and anticipate movement, other muscles are taking over for that, and then that starts to pull things out of alignment and causes strain on the pelvis, and that resonates into our muscles and other areas of the body. Strength or endurance comes into play when we go to lift something heavy. You will notice maybe many times you may go to pick up something and you find yourself holding your breath. Well, you're not doing that intentionally. That's the body doing it responsively to picking up something heavy. The reason it does that is it's creating what's known as intra-abdominal pressure in order to protect the spine from the load that we're picking up. But if the pelvic floor is weak and can't sustain that pressure we're putting on it from that load or the intra-abdominal pressure, then that can lead to symptoms like leaking, prolapse, pain, etc. So the other place that this comes into play for exercise is if you're wanting to lift heavy, maybe a heavy loaded squat or deadlifts. You want to be able to inhale, be able to engage that pelvic floor through the breath holding part, and then be able to let it go. Now, agility comes into play with things like high impact movements, jumping, skipping, running, jumping on the trampoline, jumping jacks, coughing, sneezing, anything we need to turn that pelvic floor on really quickly to sustain that instant intra-abdominal pressure that's being created from the impact of that movement. So one of the things you could do right now is give a cough a try. Can you contract your pelvic floor? Cough. Maintain that contraction through the cough and then let it go. And then you try to do that 10 times in a row, really quickly. Contract, cough, contract, cough. That's a good way to see if you can feel the connection in your pelvic floor. But you may not always be able to get into that deep layer. And so that's key. You may only be feeling that superficial layer. And then of course, when it comes to tension in the pelvic floor, if that pelvic floor is holding on to tension, that can resonate in many different things. Pain through the pubic area, low back pain because one of the pelvic floor muscles connects to the tailbone, so we can get pulling through the tailbone and back. You can have incontinence. It could be superficially holding up our pelvic organs, but once we release the tension and let go of the muscles, then we could experience symptoms like pressure from prolapse, incontinence, and so on. And that is something that I make sure I let everybody understand when they have a hypertonic pelvic floor, that underlying that tension could be weakness. And when we get rid of that tension, we could find ourselves with new symptoms that didn't exist before because they were hiding behind tension of that pelvic floor. So there is a quick lesson on understanding your pelvic floor, your pelvis, and the function of those muscles.
Seeing a pelvic floor physical therapist is the best way to know if you're doing your pelvic floor contractions correctly. You will also want to do pelvic floor exercise rehab, and for additional help, you can get a biofeedback device. I've included all the links below for resources to this information.